Buggering Freud and Deleuze Toward a Queer Theory of Masochism by Torkild Thanem and Louise Wallenberg. Abstract. Both Freud's and Deleuze's understandings of masochism limit the transgressive and subversive forces of masochism by taking sexual difference for granted. Drawing on Newton's fashion photography for Wolford and on feminist interrogations of Freud, Deleuze, and masochism, this paper therefore seeks to develop an alternative, queer theory of masochism as sexual indifference. Viewing masochism as sexual indifference opens up movements of desire beyond the heterosexual matrix of male masochists and female mistresses. This is therefore an exercise in buggery. In the first half of the paper, we bugger Freud's understanding of masochism with Deleuze's diverging understanding of masochism. In the second half, we bugger Deleuze's understanding of masochism with other parts of his own work, with feminist critique, and with Newton's photography. Introduction. While Gilles Deleuze took it upon himself to bugger the history of philosophy, Sigmund Freud constituted one of the main targets of Deleuze's buggery. One of Deleuze's main contributions in this respect was to develop an understanding of masochism in stark contrast to that provided by Freud. Deleuze rejects Freud's fusion of masochism and sadism in terms of sadomasochism. Further, he contradicts Freud's Oedipulism by constituting the mother rather than the father as the masochist's threat and love object. Still, Deleuze's writings on masochism remain trapped in a heterosexual matrix of male masochists and female mistresses. Like Freud, Deleuze takes sexual difference for granted. This is not only in contrast to Deleuze's understanding of desire as excessive multiplicity and Deleuzean notions such as the body without organs and becoming woman. It is also challenged by more recent configurations of masochist and fetishist aesthetics in Western popular culture. Famous fashion and portrait photographer Helmut Newton's fashion photography for Wolford, made in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, is a case in point here. Newton's photographs combine masochist and fetishist aesthetics wherein phallic women occupy center stage. Alongside all the usual Wolford paraphernalia, pantyhose, stockings, and lingerie, typical Freudian fetishes such as high heels, long legs, wigs, swords, whips, and sunglasses are playfully mobilized to depict acts of domination and submission. We argue that Newton's Amazon models decentralize the phallus and transgress boundaries of gender and stereotypes of womanhood. Understanding these expressions of masochist and fetishist embodiment requires a buggery of Deleuzean masochism as well as of Freudian masochism. In the first half of this paper, we therefore bugger Freud's understanding of masochism with Deleuze's diverging understanding of masochism. In the second half, we bugger Deleuze's understanding of masochism with other parts of his own work, with feminist theorizing on masochism and fetishism, and with Newton's photography. More specifically, we do so by developing a notion of what we call masochist indifference, which opens up masochist movements of desire beyond the heterosexual matrix of male masochists and female mistresses. Buggering Freud with Deleuze. Since German sexologist Richard von Krafft-Ebing first coined the term masochism in 1886, masochism has been understood as a phantasmatic process involving a fear and longing for orgasm amongst men with perverse desires of being whipped by a dominant woman or man. However, as has been pointed out by Joseph Bristow, Krafft-Ebing does not contribute much to an analysis of the cause of masochism, nor to the other perversions he described through his case studies. For this, we have to turn to Freud, his younger colleague. What Freud does is to search for the origin, the cause, the reason, the essence of sexual perversity, such as masochism, and he finds it all in the family. With his early treatise on perversions, 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, and in his later case studies, of which the studies on Little Hans and the Wolfman are the most central, Freud comes to shape the popular understanding of masochism. According to Freud, a recurring fantasy or dream found among men and women is that of a child being beaten. In both, this fantasy can be traced to early childhood, and in both, it creates a desire to masturbate. However, the fantasy means different things in men and women. Whereas the male fantasy is connected to a wish to position himself in a passive, and ostensibly feminine, position, the female fantasy involves a sadistic and guilt-ridden desire to see another child being beaten. This guilt can only be solved by the female placing herself in the position of the beaten child. In its first phase, sadism satisfies her jealousy toward the other child. In the second phase, it satisfies her guilt. It is the female's guilt-ridden second phase that has come to color our understanding of masochism as an allegedly feminine trait. The little boy's, or even the adult man's, desire to be beaten is therefore a desire that can only be understood as a desire to be feminine. Hence, only a man can desire masochism and only a man can be a masochist, but in the disguise of woman. As Freud writes, "But if, as happens so often, you meet with masochism in men, what is left to you but to say that these men exhibit very plain feminine traits?" Freud's understanding of masochism is founded on the familiar relations of the Oedipal drama. Here, femininity is constituted as passive, whereas masculinity is constituted as active. The father's dominance makes him the biggest threat to the male child. He has the power to castrate, imbue the son with lack, and turn him into a woman like his mother. While lack is deemed natural and normal in the female, it is not so in the male. The male child's castration anxiety may therefore develop into masochist perversion. The male child's guilt and fear of castration leads him to assume a passive role in order to placate the father and win his love. Being beaten by the father, then, is not only the punishment for the forbidden genital relation with the mother, but also a regressive substitute for it. But according to Freud, masochism as a sexual preference or desire in the male adult cannot stand by itself. It needs an opposite. Masochism needs sadism because every active perversion is accompanied by its passive counterpart. Freud literally just thought that from his case studies. Indeed, it is all within the masochist. At any time, the masochist can turn into a sadist, but not only are all sadists ex-masochists, both masochists and sadists are sadomasochists, as both desires are embodied within one and the same individual. One of Deleuze's main contributions to the understanding of masochism is to reject Freud's fusion of sadism and masochism and to divest and render masochism independent from sadism. On Deleuze's account, there is an irreducible dissymmetry between masochism and sadism. While Freud takes Krafft-Ebing's terms of masochism and sadism for granted and bases his understanding of sadism and masochism on his own psychoanalytical case studies, Deleuze goes back to the literary works of Marquis de Sade and Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, extending masochism beyond the clinical realm so as to interrogate its formalistic and dramaturgical structure and quality. According to Deleuze, sadism and masochism are radically different, not only as sexual practices but also as narrative structures. Whereas sadism is built on chaos, masochism is formal and dramatic, following an aesthetic which extends it into the arena of artistic form, language, and the production of pleasure through text. Masochism's formality is inscribed explicitly in the contract, governing masochist relations between two partners. This contract invests masochism with strict rules, roles, and directions. The contract is a narrative in itself, already replete with a scenario, a story, and a dramatis personae. The two parties are playing the roles that Masoch has instructed them to play. Hence, masochism is both theater and reality. While the masochistic script structures the masochistic performance, the script is first shaped by fantasy and then transformed into reality. Further on, the masochistic contract subverts the power relations of the two parties involved. While in sadism the masochist slave is in the power of the master, in masochism the master is only powerful insofar as the masochist slave confers power to the master. Hence, the masochist slave is the hero of the masochist drama. Masochism is narrativized and structured by the masochist before the actual performance can take place. Somewhat ironically, the post-Freudian psychoanalyst Bernard Binleiner helps us understand this Deleuzian point in more detail. While psychoanalysis typically views masochism as disorder and perversion, and emphasizes the victimized position of the masochist in childhood, Berliner argues that the masochist appears in a double light, as a passive victim of a brutal and traumatic childhood, and as an active troublemaker who entangles himself in actual conflict, by which he constantly makes himself victim again. He is sinned against and sinning. Though Berliner fails to ascribe any major importance to the masochist as troublemaker, this notion does make some steps toward ascribing agency and power to the masochist victim, and this further enables us to dissociate masochism from sadism. Being a troublemaker means being active in making trouble for others. This invites us to think the masochist as an agent who, via the masochist contract, actively chooses to locate himself in a passive and inferior position. Hence, there is agency and activity in the passive, because it is from this point that the masochist drama is shaped and instructed. While consistent with Deleuze, this finds further support in Theodore Rieck's notion of victory through defeat, which first captured the desperate unconscious search for control in the abused child. Disguising power as submission and control as passivity, the abused child, or the adult masochist, may position himself or herself in an imaginary position of power. Even though the masochist contract prescribes a constructed dualism between passivity and activity, between the roles of victim and dominator, on this view, both the submissive masochist and the dominant mistress are both active and passive in their role-playing. The mistress must use the masochist for her own pleasure, but she must be instructed to do so. Perhaps this explains why, on Deleuze's reading, the masochistic drama is a romantic drama. Of Masoch it can be said, as it cannot be of Sade, that no one has ever been so far with so little offense to decency. Contrary to the sadistic world of impersonal and violent sex, the masochistic world is colored by dramatic suspense and intimacy, wherein the masochist hero is a supersensual hero. As Deleuze reminds us, this echoes Mephistopheles, "Thou sensual, supersensual libertine, a little girl can lead thee by the nose." In masochism, actual and obscene, sex is therefore replaced by an idealized and romanticized eroticism, which challenges Freud's argument that the true masochist always turns his cheek whenever he has a chance of receiving a blow. Whenever the masochist turns his cheek to receive a blow, it is crucial that the blow is dealt by the right kind of person. The masochist does not take blows from just anyone. Who holds the whip is decisive. But the infliction of actual physical pain, which is deemed central to all sadistic practices, is not so in masochism. In masochism, pain remains within the realm of possibility. Pain is never actually inflicted. It does not have to be inflicted. Rather, it is the fear of pain and retribution and humiliation which drives the masochist. Hence, the masochist slave's infatuation, worship, and submission before his master is more important than physical pain or actual sex. Deleuze further challenges Freud's fusion of sadism and masochism by providing an alternative ideology of masochism. Whereas Freud's emphasis on the father's power to castrate makes the father the primary and determinant figure in the child's world, Deleuze constitutes the mother as the child's primary and determinant figure. Masochism goes back to the pregenital and symbiotic phase between child and mother. Both love object and controlling agent for the helpless child, the mother is an ambivalent figure during the child's oral phase. Breastfeeding the child, she also has the power to punish him by withholding breastfeeding and abandoning him. While sadism has nothing to do with love, masochism involves exaggerated love for the other. The masochist may therefore be punished for loving his mother too much, and for wanting her in an erotic way, despite knowing that this is the exclusive right of his father. But contrary to Freud, it is not the father who will punish him for desiring the mother, but the beloved and desired mother herself. This makes the mother dangerous as well as comforting, powerful as well as loving. The child's fear of being abandoned by the mother constitutes the primary source of her authority. Rooted in this early fear, the adult masochist recreates this scenario of abandonment by staging a movement between concealment and revelation, disappearance and appearance, seduction and rejection. In this scenario, the presence of pain functions only symbolically as a way to punish and expel the unnecessary father. Indeed, it is not the son but the father who is guilty, and the father must be punished because he is guilty of trying to come between mother and child. For Deleuze, then, masochism cannot be a question of castration anxiety because it is the mother and not the father who is the child's primary and determinant figure. By positioning the mother in the symbolic and leaving the father powerless, Deleuze further invalidates Freud's Oedipal scenario. For Deleuze, masochism is the female dominion par excellence. Hence, one should not be surprised if, or when, masochism emerges in an affair of women. Whereas sadism, as its incommensurable counterpart, stands for the active negation of the mother and the inflation of the father, masochism proceeds by a twofold disavowal, a positive, idealizing disavowal of the mother, who is identified with the law, and an invalidating disavowal of the father, who is expelled from the symbolic order. The adult male masochist reenacts this mother-child relationship, but even though the mistress punishes the masochist hero in performing the mother role, this is no sadistic punishment. Rather, she inflicts cruelty in love to fulfill her part of the contract. As his mother, she must be ambivalent, dangerous, and comforting. While punishment is governed by the masochistic contract, she must also punish any attempt to trespass or divert from the contract. Reenacting the mother-child relationship involves reenacting the pregenital and symbiotic relationship between mother and child. But the fantasy of entering into complete symbiosis with her and becoming one with her body can only happen in the imagination, as real unity means death. Hence, death becomes the fantasy solution to masochistic desire, and the orgasm, the little death, must be postponed. While the orgasm is important in the masochist's imagination and fantasy of what is to come, it must be postponed for the masochist to survive. Hence, Masoch's heroes are forever swooning into a faint before the blissful moment of consumption. I tore off the ermine jacket and the lace and felt her naked bosom heaving against mine. Then I lost consciousness. Seemingly on top. Although the mother replaces the father both as threat and love object in Deleuze's analysis of masochism, it provides no real space for a female subject. Woman may be the dominatrix and the one on top as she sets the rules, but this is a false mask of power. It is the male masochist who is the real subject, as he is the one who forces her to impersonate his dream figure of cold, perfect, and dominant womanhood, Deleuze writes. In our opinion, the woman torturer belongs entirely to masochism. Admittedly, she is not a masochistic character, but she is a pure element of masochism. The torturess escapes from her own masochism by assuming the active role in the masochistic situation. She is thus only an object obeying his wishes to play the part that he has forced upon her, and as it is often claimed, it is the bottom that holds the real power. This applies both to a purely masochistic scenario and to a sadomasochistic scenario. Hence, in the heterosexual yet queer setting referred to by Deleuze, the female is seemingly on top. However, given that there is no sadist element to this specific masochistic situation, hers is also a position of masochism, just as that of her slave. She is, as a dominatrix, only a vehicle for the masochistic male's lust. There is no real power in her hands, as she carries out the acts that her male slave demands of her. She cannot be empowered by her own will, nor find pleasure in that position, as this would interrupt the trajectory that the masochist has set out for her. Therefore, this is a game that only on the surface is about role swapping and female domination. The dominated male is always in control. Deleuze, however, is fully aware of this. The woman torturer of masochism cannot be sadistic, precisely because she is in the masochistic situation. She is an integral part of it, a realization of the masochistic fantasy. She belongs in the masochistic world, not in the sense that she has the same tastes as her victim, but because her sadism is a kind never found in the sadist. It is, as it were, the double or the reflection of masochism. The same is true of sadism. Thus, the dominant female is left as an empty mask, a performance and a fantasy created by the male. It seems as if the heterosexual structure of masoch cannot possibly leave any real power to the female agent, because in his defeat to her, he is the one holding the victory. Hence, it might be argued that the inherent sexual inequality that informs any heterosexual sadomasochistic relation, according to many anti-pornography feminists, is equally present within the masochistic setting. However, if discussing masochistic practices and desires within a strict post-structuralist framing, it is possible to temporarily leave the political reality of gender inequality behind. Within this chassis, the disintegration of the liberal subject may offer radically subversive possibilities. Following Katja Silverman's exploration of male masochism, one can start viewing masochism as one of several deviant masculinities that represents a tacit challenge not only to conventional male subjectivity, but to the whole world, calling sexual difference into question, and beyond that, reality itself. Male masochism, then, within this theoretical framing, betrays the phallic standard and hands it over, in theory, to the female. And if turning our gaze to the ads of fashion photographer Helmut Newton, made for the Austrian underwear and pantyhose manufacturer Wolford, displaying phallic women who we read as representations of powerful mistresses, we may find room for gender subversion and equality. These images offer a questioning and a critique of dominant notions of masochism and its heterosexual contract, as stipulated by Freud and Deleuze. Their treatises of masochism, as has been pointed out above, are heavily rooted in a strict and heterosexual matrix of male masochists and female mistresses, both of them relying on sexual difference as natural and desirable.